Hello, and welcome to the History of the Germans, episode 188. What has printing ever done for us? Which is also episode 4 of season 11, The Empire in the 15th Century. Quote, "We should note the force, effect, and consequences of inventions which are nowhere more conspicuous than in those three which were unknown to the ancients, namely printing, gunpowder, and the compass. For these three have changed the appearance and the state of the world," wrote Francis Bacon in 1620, and almost everybody agreed. Printing changed everything. But how exactly did it change everything? That is a question nobody posed properly until Elisabeth L. Eisenstein got on the academic stage in the 1970s, and the debate has not yet stopped. In this episode, I will try to take you through some of Eisenstein's ideas on the how of the change, and in the end attempt a rain check on what we can learn from it for the information revolution we're living through right now. No worries, this is still the history of the Germans, so we will talk facts and dates and processes, with only very occasional attempts at breaking into the ivory tower. But before we start, let me again press the point that the History of the Germans podcast is advertising free, thanks to the support of our patrons. And you can become a patron too by signing up on my website, historyofthegermans.com/support, and enjoy the warm glow of your fellow listeners' appreciation. And special thanks go to Christina K., Kurt Burkhardt, James L., Mark Pearson, Dave G., and Dr. Volker Schulte, who have already taken the plunge. And with that, back to the show. Last week, we ended on Gutenberg having published his famous Bible in 42 lines of beautifully accurate letters. And we also heard that at the same time he lost his workshop to his financial backer, Johann Fust, who hired Peter Schöffer, a former calligrapher and Gutenberg's apprentice, to run the print shop. Gutenberg himself kept printing, though scholars keep getting into fierce debates about which book was printed by him, how and where it was printed. But what is undisputed is that the next really groundbreaking book was published by Fust and Schöffer, the Mainz Psalter. Another exquisitely printed book that saw the first use of multiple colors, decorative initials, and a colophon, the printer's mark declaring who made it, when, and sometimes also why. But Mainz was not the only place to boast a printing press. Already by 1457, Heinrich Eggerstein and Johannes Mentelin, apprentices of Gutenberg, opened a printing press in Strasbourg. In 1458, a Frenchman showed up in Mainz, sent by his king to do a bit of commercial espionage. In 1461, the Mainzer Stiftsfehde, the Archbishop's War, broke out, and a year later the city was sacked. As a consequence, Gutenberg fled and opened up a new shop in Eltville, whilst Fust and Schöffer remained, and after things had calmed down, then resumed printing. But in the meantime, their associates and apprentices had set out to seek their fortunes elsewhere. There was already a printing workshop in Bamberg by 1459. In 1465 there's one in Cologne, Basel and Augsburg opened in 1468, Nuremberg in 1470, and by 1500 there were printers in 60 different German cities. And many cities had more than one printer. Strasbourg, for instance, housed 50 printers by 1500. And these German printing apprentices did not just stay in Germany. They spread all across Europe, founding workshops in Rome in 1460, Venice 1469, Paris in 1470, Segovia in 1472, Budapest and Krakow in 1473, Leuven 1474, London comparatively late in 1476, Odense in Denmark in 1482. The first printing shop in Africa was opened in Sao Tome and Principe in 1494 by a certain Valentin of Moravia. Within 50 years, 1,000 printing businesses had opened all across Europe and had produced 15 to 20 million books, as many as had been produced by scribes in all the preceding centuries. Not that anyone can prove that statement, but just sounds incredibly cool. So, it's boom time, and printing is going to grow in a straight line to today, where in the US alone about 700 million books are printed every year. No, nothing grows in a straight line, not even new technologies. By 1500, the printing industry experienced a terrible bust. Why? Gutenberg's ambition had been to print the best possible Bible. What he meant by that was a Bible that looked and felt very much like a medieval manuscript, just infinitely more consistent, more precise, and more legible than any monk in his scriptorium could ever achieve. And who were these books made for? Well, the same clientele who bought books before, the church and the great princes. A Bible like the Gutenberg Bible of 1454 or the Mainz Psalter of 1457 were far too expensive to be bought by a country parson. They were made for bishops and abbots. And then we have the huge bibliophiles of the 14th and 15th century, King Wenceslas the Lazy and the Duc de Berry, the brother of the French king. These collectors had commissioned some of the most breathtaking illuminated manuscripts, like a spectacular copy of the Golden Bull, complete with birds and bathing girls. And then you have the Très riche Heure of the Duc de Berry, probably the apotheosis of illuminated manuscripts, images you will recognize instantly. There was no way printers could match this kind of mastery, and in fact, they haven't, even till today. Books like these were luxury objects, and their owners used them as status symbols. But owning a full Bible or Psalter stopped being such a status symbol when there are not just thousands, but tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of such books out there. Sure, not as lavishly decorated, but in terms of content, the same. So, these great collectors diverted their cash away from books to Roman statues for their gardens, to lions and rhinoceros for their menageries, and tapestries and pictures for their staterooms. Printers had made the mistake of asking their clients what they wanted, and then produced exactly that. And as Henry Ford once said, if I asked my client what they want, they would have said, a faster horse. Printing became a solution in search of a problem. As demand dwindled, painting became concentrated in the major commercial centers in Strasbourg, Nuremberg, Augsburg, as well as Venice and Paris. What kept printers alive weren't the great, beautiful editions that are now gathered in the Morgan Library in New York, but very pedestrian, simple documents, most of which ended up as wastepaper. The largest print runs were the same that helped Gutenberg in the beginning, schoolbooks and indulgences. In 1515, Pope Leo X asked printers in Germany to produce 200,000 indulgences forms. Some presses survived in places where a local ruler sponsored them, for instance to produce their ordinances and political pronouncements, or to serve a newly founded university, like, say, Wittenberg. This commercial malaise ended with the appearance of Martin Luther. The printing of his 95 Theses and subsequent pamphlets did not only change the world of religion and politics, but also the world of printing. Wherever there was a printing press, his tracts and those of his adversaries were produced in the hundreds of thousands, not on behalf of the church or on behalf of a prince, but to satisfy customer demand. But to say that Luther single-handedly saved printing does not sound convincing. Like all of us will ultimately do, Martin Luther shuffled off his mortal coil in 1546, ending the flood of letters, tracts and Bibles. Still, printing has continued ever since. Hence printing must have provided something to its consumers that they cherished and that they were willing to pay for. Was it simply the mass availability of books, or was there more to it? Now, whilst pretty much everyone, almost from Gutenberg's day onwards, agreed that printing fundamentally changed the world, nobody really dug into the question of what exactly it was that the use of movable type changed. Until the 1970s, when the American historian Elisabeth Eisenstein developed her groundbreaking thesis, The Printing Press as an Agent of Change. Eisenstein broke down the differences between manuscript culture before Gutenberg and printing culture after 1450. Much of what she identified is still not fully explored in detail, nor is it neatly organized into lists and frameworks, but enough to make a subjective list of what the printing press has ever done for us. Now, the first thing that the invention of movable type changed was the accuracy of content. In a world where each and every book was a handwritten copy of a handwritten copy, the question whether the words on the page were in any way related to the original text depended on the diligence of every single scribe in the long line of scribes stretching back to when Aristotle dropped his pen in 322 BC. There's no reason to believe that master printers and compositors in the 16th century were any more diligent than the monks in their scriptoria. A Bible printed in 1631 posited, "Thou shalt commit adultery," and revealed in Deuteronomy 5 that "the Lord our God hath showed us his glory and his great arts." But what made printed books more accurate were three things. First, most print shops employed a corrector who would read through the preprint and seek out errors. These men were often learned scholars or the authors themselves. Then there was the scrutiny of readers. If a book was printed in an edition of 1,000 copies, at least 1,000 if not more people would actually read it, and they might see logical or grammatical errors, or they may find deviations from other editions of the same work. These errors they would then report back to the printer or publisher. Meanwhile, a handwritten manuscript would only be read by a handful of people, and in the case of the magnificent illuminated copies, probably even fewer. And it was most unlikely that two copies of the same book would be in the same library, making it hard to identify the difference in versions. And once an error had been identified, it would only be corrected in the margins of this copy, not the ones further up the chain. And then there was the question what a printer could do once an error was spotted. He could and he would regularly issue errata, alerting readers to mistakes made. And by the next edition, these errors would be eradicated. So over time, definitive versions of the Greek philosophers, the doctors of the church, the Roman poets and historians, and so much more were created through these iterations. These more accurate versions of existing texts then became the foundations on which to expand knowledge further. One example on how this worked was the Theatrum Orbis Terrarum, the first true modern atlas being published from 1570 onwards in Antwerp by Abraham Ortelius. This work comprised 70 maps in its first edition. Ortelius invited readers and cartographers to highlight errors, suggest edits, and send in their own maps. Some, not all of the suggestions were then incorporated into the next edition. By the 25th edition in 1598, the Theatrum Orbis Terrarum had grown to 167 maps, and Ortelius cited 183 cartographers who have contributed to the work. Such collaborative effort would not have been possible without the ability to produce editions of several hundreds or thousands of copies to interested readers to check and review. That being said, printers also published a whole lot of nonsense. Gutenberg himself had brought out the prophecies of the Sibyl, some weird predictions that trace back to a member of the Flagellants, these men and women who staged processions during the Black Death, whipping themselves as a means to fend off evil, whilst probably adding to the spread of the disease. One of the most popular of these nonsense books were the writings of Hermes Trismegistus, a combination of the Greek god Hermes and the Egyptian god Thoth. These books allegedly contained all the world's wisdom that God had shared with Adam just before the expulsion from paradise. Adam had then passed it on to this Greco-Egyptian god who compiled all that could ever be known about philosophy, the natural sciences, and everything else in one great book to be shared amongst the people. And as they did it, in the process of copying through the millennia, much content was lost or became garbled. Astrologers and alchemists in particular took the text as a starting point to recover the wisdom of the ancients and find the philosopher's stone. Now, before we laugh about the foolishness of our ancestors, we should remember that 15th century society had not caught up with ancient Greece and Rome. Hence, researching how the ancients did build their houses and temples, healed their sick or organized their state, were ways to progress society. And by 1500, who knew which of these ancient texts contained groundbreaking insights and which ones were nonsense? Well, nobody could know. This information needed to be reviewed and experimented with. And in the case of the so-called Hermetic writings, it took until 1614 before they were debunked. But, and that is the important point, they were debunked through investigation and experiment. The modern way we split fact from fiction. The next feature that printing added to books was permanence. Not permanence of the physical book, which was printed on paper, material much less durable than parchment, but the continuation of the content. Before printing, books simply disappeared because abbots or university deans decided a particular work was not worth to be copied again. After Gutenberg, it was the printer, and that meant ultimately the market, the interested public, who determined what was to survive. And given the lower cost of printing, even a comparatively small number of readers could ensure the continued existence of a piece of writing. Having increasingly more accurate and more permanent, and just simply more content, was a huge step forward. But all of it would have been useless without the ability to locate and then consume that information. Let me explain this with the book I hold in my hand right now. Its title is The Gutenberg Parenthesis. The title is intriguing and at least points towards what the book is likely to contain, which is why I borrowed it from the library. Before printing, books were usually referred to by the first 2 or 3 words of the actual text, so a bit like papal bulls. The most recent papal bull from May 9th, 2024 is entitled Spes non confundit, meaning hope does not disappoint. 10 points to Gryffindor if you can tell from the title alone what this papal bull is about. Now let's go back to my book and look at the title page. There it says, The Age of Print and Its Lessons for the Internet, and gives me the name of the author, Jeff Jarvis, and the publisher. So by now I have a pretty decent idea what this book is likely to be about. Most medieval manuscripts did not have a front page. Text starts immediately with a nicely drawn initial top left. No clues what the rest of the text will be about. And then in my book we come to the contents page. Each chapter has its own title, which conveys even more information, like Chapter 2, How to Print. Again, quite clear what this will be about. Plus a page number, so I can go straight there and read that particular chapter. Manuscript, no table of contents, no page numbers. At the back of my book, there's an index. If I want to check back on what this particular author said about Ortelius Theatrum, the index directs me to page 73. Now, imagine you're a scholastic scholar and you're debating a point of theology with another scholar in a disputation. That is what they did in medieval universities. Your opponent makes the point that Thomas Aquinas said in his Summa Theologica that Jesus avoided extreme poverty. Now, you doubt that. So where in the Summa Theologica of Aquinas is that statement? Now these words appear in Part 3, Question 4, Article 3. In the internet copy I found of it, it is on page 5051. How could you find this quotation in a huge book with no page numbers, no list of contents and no index, and all that while you're still in the midst of a debate. So just imagine how much time medieval scholars must have spent trying to find the right quotations in their handwritten books. What made that even harder was the layout of sentences and pages. You remember how hard Gutenberg worked to make sure both columns of his Bible were perfectly symmetrical and justified on the right. That looks beautiful, but it doesn't necessarily aid legibility. No paragraphs, limited punctuation, Gothic script, just very hard. And then there is the problem of finding the book. As the age of print progressed, libraries began organizing their books in systems, alphabetically or by topic, and then within topic again alphabetically. And they would create catalogs, first as lists, but then the card catalog, allowing readers to search by author or by topic. Bibliographies told scholars what books existed and where to find them, and booksellers produced lists of titles they either had available or knew how to procure. These somewhat mundane conditions and processes were of incredible importance. As you most probably know, it wasn't the fall of Constantinople in 1453 that suddenly released Greek and Roman literature into Western Europe. As we discussed, for example, in episode 172, the participants of the Council of Constance set out in search of lost books amongst the German monasteries, because the Italian and the Greek ones had already been thoroughly searched for ancient writings. In other words, the information was already there. The problem had been accessibility. Now, with editions of hundreds or thousands of copies, title pages, page numbers, agreed titles, the connections began to form, like neurons starting to fire together in the brain, wiring distant areas of learning and understanding together. And as these networks expanded, they became able to perform ever more complex functions, propelling what we call the Renaissance to a higher level, initiating the Reformation and facilitating the rise of modern science. The emergence of the printed book changed the way information was consumed. Before printing, books were most often read aloud. University professors would read the works to students, hence the term lecture. Monks and priests read the gospel aloud during services. Private, silent reading was unusual, in part because very few people privately owned books. They went into libraries or universities to hear them being read out. But now, as the numbers of available books had grown 1,000-fold, individuals owned their own books and could read them in private. And when you read silently, thoughts can penetrate your head more easily. You can stop mid-sentence and you can check back. More connections are made and more ideas, more questions occupy the reader. Eisenstein was also fascinated with the early printer workshops. This was a place where artisans of various kinds, typecutters, compositors, printers came together with writers and intellectuals in an environment overseen by the master printer, himself often writer, translator, editor, and entrepreneur. Erasmus famously proofread his works at the Basel workshop of Johann Froben. These places were places of secular intellectual exchange, not seen in Europe since the Roman baths closed in the 5th century. And this link between printing and intellectual gatherings continued into the London coffee houses of the 17th and 18th century, whose proprietors issued newspapers to their patrons, keen to discuss the latest inventions, political shenanigans, society gossip, as well as maritime insurance. Which gets us to the next point. In the Middle Ages, the ultimate decision which book was replicated and thereby disseminated lay with the abbot who ran the scriptorium. That monopoly had already softened as commercial copyists set up shop in the major cities and universities, producing whatever their customers asked for. But these customers tended to be either members of the church or aspiring to a career in theology or law. Master printers were first and foremost entrepreneurs. For their business model to work, they needed to find buyers for their print runs that quickly went from a few hundred to 1,000 and then ever and ever more. The church was a huge customer and, as we have seen with Gutenberg, Fust and Schoeffer, remained so for a long time. But the church was not the sole customer. Printers famously produced Luther's writings, but also more and more works that had less to do with religious education. One early bestseller was The Ship of Fools from 1494. In it, Sebastian Brandt tells of a whole fleet of silly, coarse and vulgar people setting off from Basel to Narragonian, the paradise of fools. It is a satire about the late medieval early Renaissance society, and it features, as the first of the fools, the book fool, a man who is immensely proud of the large number of books he had acquired, but which he has never read. The fact that by 1494 someone like a book fool could exist says a lot about the proliferation of printing and the taste of its readers. When we talk about printing, it is important to remember that printed books sometimes contain more than just text. They also contained images, initially woodcuts and later engravings. These techniques predate printing, but found a new and important application in books. The Ship of Fools was decorated with 103 woodcuts, according to some the work of Albrecht Dürer. But there is one book you will almost immediately recognize, not for its text, but for its magnificent woodcuts. The Schädelsche Weltchronik, or Nuremberg Chronicle as it's known in the Anglo-Saxon world. This enormous undertaking was initiated by two Nuremberg merchants in 1491 as a commercial venture. On 656 pages in the Latin version and 596 in the German one, Hartmann Schädel drones on about the history of the world from the day of creation until 1493. The writing is in the main plagiarized from existing authors, including works by the inevitable Silvio Aeneas Piccolomini. And where it is by the man himself, it is apparently extraordinarily dull. But nobody cared about that. The 1,809 printed images, in particular the 31 double-sided views of major European cities, are instantly recognizable. Sure, some woodcuts were used several times, giving Naples and Florence as well as Strasbourg and Mainz an uncanny similarity. But still, what a masterpiece of the art of the woodcut. Commercially, total disaster. Anton Koberger, by then Europe's first media tycoon, operating 12 presses with agents all across Europe, had printed around 2,500 copies of the book, of which more than 500 had remained unsold by 1509. Anton Koberger's financial hardships were, however, not the only downsides the rise of printing brought into the world. The drive towards definitive versions that had made books more accurate and more permanent led at the same time to standardization, crowding out diversity. Printers in the 16th century produced costume books, giving an idea what people in different countries were wearing. These images were pored over by artists who included them in their paintings if they were painting foreigners, from where they returned back into woodcuts and engravings, developing into stereotypes with a life of their own. Not every Spanish lady wears a flamenco dress, nor would you see a pair of lederhosen in Hamburg or Düsseldorf. Actually, I take this back. There are enough pseudo-Bavarians in Düsseldorf that you may see them occasionally. Once copies of Vitruvius' book on architecture, complete with exquisite engravings, appeared everywhere from Stockholm to Seville, its stringent rules about the order of columns, proportions, symmetry, etc. spread with it. Not that European architecture became uniform overnight, but distinct local styles became regional and by the 19th century national and international by the 20th. Whilst architecture moved slowly, the standardization of language moved much faster. Bible translations, like Luther's, set the standard for unified language for the German lands, relegating, for example, Low German to being a dialect. This process at different times and triggered by different books took place all across Europe. For me, the most confusing of these standardizations is the Germanic part of Switzerland, where the language that people actually speak, Swiss German, is not the language they write in. Swiss newspapers, novels and even poems are in High German, easy to understand for me, whilst I am completely lost when listening to locals on Zurich's Bahnhofstrasse. But it is not just language. In 1542, the historian Johann Sleidan wrote, quote, "As if to offer proof that God had chosen to accomplish a special mission, there was invented in our land a marvelous, new and subtle art, the art of printing. This opened German eyes even as it is now bringing enlightenment to other countries." End quote. Gutenberg's invention came in the midst of the low point of the empire, and the ever more persistent realization that the country was falling behind its neighbors, politically and economically. In this time and the centuries that followed, German national pride could not attach to great battles and far-flung lands conquered, but it focused on culture, language, and ingenuity. Gutenberg's printing press was the first of a long list of engineering achievements that formed part of the self-image of Germans then and still today. This brings us now almost to modern times, where we may be facing another shift on the scale of Gutenberg's printing press. The internet and all its offshoots, from search engines to social media and artificial intelligence. I will not pretend that I could predict the future. I did that for a decade, and I could never figure out which of my many predictions would actually come true. But there is an interesting theory making the rounds in media studies, called the Gutenberg parenthesis. The idea is that there were modes of communication and interaction that existed before the printed book that went into some sort of hibernation between 1450 or 1600 and 2000 and are now returning via the internet. Specifically, the idea is that before Gutenberg, information gathering and dissemination was a collaborative, lay, largely oral process. So, for instance, the Hanseatic merchants were receiving information from their correspondents in the other cities, while simultaneously disseminating information to their friends at home and recipients abroad. This kind of information gathering and dissemination was then largely replaced by newspapers from the 17th century onwards. People no longer needed a friend telling them the price of copper in London. They could look it up in the back pages of the precursors of the Financial Times. Print created a world in which certain institutions acquired the credibility and later the monopoly to disseminate information. And this did not just apply to hard facts. In pre-Gutenberg times, narratives like the chivalric romances, the tales of King Arthur, were altered and added to, first by oral storytellers and then by writers. There was no single author of the definitive version of the legends of Parsifal. Sebastian Brand was ranting about editions of his Ship of Fools containing new text he had never written. By the 18th century, copyright allowed authors to keep control over their creations, which is why Goethe's Faust has a final approved version, whilst Shakespeare's Hamlet has competing versions. The information age has revived some of these pre-Gutenberg ways of producing and sharing content. When important news break, journalists go to social media looking for videos made by bystanders, rather than wait for their correspondents to make his or her way to the scene. And since we can all access these same videos, we receive information at the same time and in the same way as the professionals. And not only that. We pass this information on to our contacts, usually with a comment, giving our assessment of what we think it's supposed to mean. And this comment is then passed through the chain again, very much like our Hanseatic merchants shared information and comments with their friends and colleagues. And as information gathering and dissemination is democratized, organizations like Wikipedia can become the repository of knowledge superior to any encyclopedia, and Bellingcat can investigate events more thoroughly and more effectively than intelligence agencies. As for fiction, I guess some of you are familiar with apps like Wattpad, fanfiction.net or AO3, where anyone can publish their own stories, some genuinely new creations, but many as variants of existing novels or universes. There are at least 810,000 fanfiction extensions of the Harry Potter universe, a very modern version of the retelling and the embellishing of the Knights of the Round Table. 3 of the top 10 books in the US year-to-date are from authors who started out as self-publishing writers, without the support of editors and marketing budgets. Some of these authors have risen to success via BookTok, where 730 million monthly active users swap tips about books to read. And this podcast too owes its existence to the replacement of the monopoly of publishers by collaborative tech. Yes, podcasts are probably the most linear of modern media, with a host or hosts droning on about whatever they want to talk about. Nevertheless, when I listen to a podcast, I feel part of a community, much of what I believe it was like listening to a storyteller on a medieval market square. It is a very different and more ancient experience than watching a documentary on television. Sure, there are huge problems with social media. I guess you all know them, so there's really no need to list them here. But at the same time, we should not forget that there are material upsides. And in the same way that printing of Luther's theses drowned Europe in a tsunami of death and destruction hitherto unknown to humanity, printing also replaced Hermes Trismegistus with Newton, Einstein, and Stephen Hawking. It took a while, and pain came before gain, but gain came. And that is it with the armchair philosophy and its cousin, the media studies. Next week we will go back to our usual fare of princely pursuits of harassed heiresses and battled bishops. We will drop further south from the city of Mainz and meet the next elector, the Count Palatinate on the Rhine. I hope you will join us again. And as you may have noticed, all these positive changes in the world of information gathering and dissemination, Wikipedia, Bellingcat, and New Fiction, rely in the main on users voluntarily contributing to what they perceive as valuable, rather than advertising. Hence, if you are inclined to support this particular revolution in human communication in its grassroots, go to historyofthegermans.com/support and sign up as a patron. It'll be very much appreciated.